Deep within each of us lies an intricate genetic blueprint, composed of approximately 3.16 billion base pairs of DNA. These sequences not only encode the instructions for life, but also conceal some of the most profound and unsettling secrets of our biological past. According to recent studies, there is compelling evidence that not too long ago, much of the known world was engulfed in widespread and brutal conflict. This violence was so intense that its consequences still echo in our genetic makeup today. Although this ancient turmoil remains largely unknown to most, some researchers suggest that it might have been humanity's first global conflict, spanning vast territories across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. It created a world where violence was nearly universal and escape was impossible. Finding evidence of such an event is rare, especially when it emerges from our own DNA. That's precisely what a team of scientists claims to have discovered. Their analysis of modern human genomes revealed signs of a significant genetic bottleneck that drastically altered male lineage thousands of years ago. A mysterious genetic bottleneck. In genetics, a bottleneck occurs when a population experiences a sudden and severe decline in numbers, leading to reduced genetic diversity. These events are not uncommon in nature. Even humans have endured multiple genetic bottlenecks. One particularly catastrophic instance occurred around 900,000 years ago, likely due to environmental disasters. However, the bottleneck identified by these reasons was far more recent and likely the result of human actions rather than natural forces. By studying chromosomal sequences in modern populations, scientists detected a dramatic decline in genetic diversity during the late Neolithic period in regions across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The findings suggest that an extraordinary number of people either perished or vanished in a relatively short span of time. Yet, what makes this discovery even more puzzling is who was affected. Unlike most population bottlenecks, which impact both sexes, this genetic collapse was observed exclusively in Y chromosome. The genetic marker passed only from father to son. Strangely, mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited from mothers, showed no significant reduction in This unusual disparity raises profound questions. What could have caused such a selective and large-scale loss of male lineages? What happened during this period that reshaped human ancestry so drastically? In other words, something extraordinary must have occurred, something that devastated a vast number of men, while leaving women relatively unaffected. This anomaly led researchers to a startling hypothesis. An unprecedented wave of violence might be the answer. If a natural disaster, such as a volcanic eruption, extreme weather, or another environmental catastrophe had been responsible, the genetic impact would have been distributed more evenly across both sexes. Instead, the loss was heavily concentrated in male lineages, suggesting something far more sinister. And in reality, drop is not a strong enough word to describe what happened to the male population. Decimation would be far more accurate. Scientists estimate that this event was so catastrophic that by the time it ended, the effective male population in Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East had been reduced by up to 95%. To put it into perspective, that means that only 1 in 20 men survived, while the number of women may have outnumbered men by as much as 17 to 1. No known war in recorded history even comes close to this level of devastation. Not even World War I or World War II. To replicate a conflict of this scale in today's world, it would require the deaths of approximately 3.9 billion men, leaving only around 200 million males alive worldwide. Given the scale of this supposed conflict, one might reasonably expect to find physical evidence, mass graves, skeletal remains, or signs of large-scale violence. And as it turns out, there are plenty. In fact, the number of violent deaths from this period is hard to ignore. Over 250 late Neolithic sites have been discovered in Europe alone, containing clear evidence of mass killings. More broadly, Neolithic humans are notorious for being found in gruesome conditions, displaying unmatched levels of bodily harm, far more than those observed in earlier or later human remains. This grim archaeological record raises an unsettling question. What really happened during this period, and why was it so uniquely brutal? A comprehensive analysis of over 2,300 early farmers revealed that more than 10% of men and women wore weapon-inflicted injuries, likely the result of raiding parties or violent struggles over crops and livestock. Another study of 338 individuals in Spain found that 23% had suffered aggressive trauma, with adult and adolescent males being disproportionately affected. These men accounted for 97% of the unhealed injuries and 81% of the healed wounds, suggesting that surviving multiple violent encounters was a common experience during this time. While these numbers are alarmingly high, they still do not reach the staggering 95% male mortality rate inferred from genetic studies. However, researchers emphasize that many fatal injuries leave no skeletal trace. Studies indicate that only 15% of melee deaths caused by sharp weapons leave bone lesions, meaning that much of the violence remains undetectable in the archaeological record. Additionally, indirect causes of death, such as infections, disease, and starvation, would have further compounded the devastation associated with large-scale conflict, the era of battles and massacres. This was not the first period in human history to witness murder on a large scale, but the frequency and brutality of killings during this time were exceptional. Scientists have identified two particularly common forms of violence: pitched battles and massacres, with numerous sites revealing indiscriminate slaughter. One of the most harrowing examples is the Talheim death pit in Germany, dated to approximately 5000 BC here. Archaeologists unearthed the remains of at least 34 individuals who had been ruthlessly killed. What makes this site especially chilling is that none of the skeletons displayed defensive wounds, suggesting that the victims were fleeing rather than fighting when they were struck down. The killing blows across all victims fell into just three categories. 1. Cuts made by the sharp edge of an adze-like tool. 2. Blunt force trauma from the reverse side of the same tool. 3. Arrow wounds, though only 3 of the 34 individuals had been killed this way. Analysis of the skulls also revealed a clear pattern. Attackers targeted the head, with all but 4 skeletons showing fatal cranial injuries, some inflicted on top of already deadly wounds. Among the dead were 16 children, 9 adult men, and 7 elderly women, a chilling testament to the indiscriminate nature of the massacre. One of the most striking aspects of Neolithic massacre sites is the noticeable absence of younger women among the victims. This recurring pattern suggests that they were seen as valuable, likely taken as trophies or captives by the victorious attackers. The Talheim massacre, for instance, took place within a fortified settlement equipped with palisades, reinforcing the idea that, even in prehistoric times, humans needed protection from other humans. This need for fortifications is further supported by other mass killing sites found in similarly defended settlements. A particularly gruesome example is the Schlitz massacre, which likely occurred in May, not far from Talheim, but across the modern border in Austria. Unlike Talheim, the Schlitz massacre was even deadlier, with archaeologists uncovering the remains of at least 200 victims. Their bodies had been carelessly dumped into a mass grave, following what appears to have been a violent raid on their settlement. Similar to other massacres from this period, women were largely absent, while men bore the brunt of the slaughter. However, Schlitz differed in several ways. 1. While adult women were likely kidnapped, so were many pre-teens and young teenagers, as their absence among the dead was also noticeable. 2. A gruesome discovery at the site was that many of the victims were found without their arms and legs, while severed skulls were discovered separately, suggesting ritualistic torture, mutilation, or this brutality may have been a tradition for the attacking party, showcasing variations in warrior customs across different groups. For example, in parts of Asia, headhunting was a particularly common practice among warrior societies. Hershheim, the largest prehistoric mass grave. One of the most haunting examples of Neolithic violence is Hershheim, in modern-day Germany, where the largest prehistoric mass grave known to date has been uncovered. Unlike Talheim and Schlitz, Hershheim does not appear to have been the site of a devastated settlement. Instead, evidence suggests that this was a community of raiders responsible for mass killings on an unprecedented scale. Archaeologists have identified at least 80 pits outside this 15-acre village, filled to the brim with victims of their conquests. Estimates suggest that over 1,000 individuals, possibly up to 1,500, were killed here, ranging in age from newborns to the elderly. The sheer scale of these killings raises chilling questions about the true nature of prehistoric warfare, suggesting that organized violence and conquests were deeply ingrained in early human societies, far earlier than previously believed. To put this into perspective, if we adjusted for population differences between then and now, it would be equivalent to a modern city constructing a mass grave containing over 800,000 bodies just outside its walls. What makes Herxheim even more disturbing is the systematic way in which the victims were processed. The local population dismembered, shattered bones, and cleaved skulls in half, indicating a methodical and ritualistic approach to their killings. In fact, the sheer number of skulls that were cut open and seemingly defleshed has led researchers to believe that this society practiced skull cultism, using human heads in ritualistic ceremonies, and most likely consuming them as well. The brain appears to have been a highly prized part of the body, likely due to its fatty content. Additionally, evidence suggests that tongues were frequently removed from the deceased, while bones were crushed to extract marrow, a valuable nutrient source. To make matters even more unsettling, scientists noticed an unusual scarcity of spongy bone elements, suggesting that many of these softer bones had been fully consumed. Certain bones, such as and hand phalanges, finger bones, showed clear evidence of preferential biting, indicating that these parts may have been particularly favored for consumption. Furthermore, many of the remains showed signs of cooking, with some even displaying marks consistent with being spit-roasted over an open fire. When the grisly feast was over, the bones were repurposed, fashioned to decups, tools, or ornaments. Some were even placed on spikes near the settlement's entrance, possibly serving as grisly warnings to outsiders. Needless to say, Herxheim was one of the worst places a person could be captured, but escaping them might have been even more difficult than expected. Despite the lack of advanced transportation, the Herxheim raiders waged war on a vast scale, targeting individuals from widely different cultures, some of whom came from as far as 300 miles, 482 kilometers away. The victims were not from a single background. Isotope analysis revealed that some were hunter-gatherers, others were farmers, and still others had originated from both mountainous and lowland regions. All of this strongly suggests that Herxheim's inhabitants were not only ruthlessly violent, but also highly organized, capable of executing strategic raids that required advanced tactics and logistics, far beyond what was once believed possible for prehistoric societies. Although Herxheim was considered a large settlement by Neolithic standards, it was still shockingly small in comparison to modern expectations. In fact, despite its notoriety, its population may have been fewer than 50 people at any given time, yet they managed to leave behind one of the most horrifying legacies in prehistory. This makes their brutality all the more impressive in a deeply disturbing way. However, many mysteries remain about Herxheim, particularly regarding the identity of the dead. Were they captives taken in war, enslaved individuals, or simply unlucky travelers who wandered too close? Even more puzzling is what ultimately happened to the people of Herxheim. Some archaeological tests suggest that the settlement was abandoned not long after the massacre, with a maximum occupation of only 50 years after the burials. This has led some to speculate that a vengeful group may have arrived seeking retribution, wiping out the settlement entirely. Neolithic warfare, a brutal landscape of violence. Herxheim may be the most gruesome sight we have discovered, but its unusual and specific brutality was not an isolated case. Far from it. The Parthians, absolutely xenophobic tribes that hunted down and mutilated outsiders. Yep, that happened too. Fighters who buried their enemies alive. Unfortunately, that was also a reality. The range of cruelty in prehistoric warfare was staggering, and so was the diversity of weapons. Warriors fought with a wide arsenal of blunt and sharp weapons, including ADCs, spears, bows and arrows, axes, clubs, knives, scrapers, sickles, and hoes, hammers, and many more. Yet, despite these advancements in weaponry, armor technology lagged far behind. There is no evidence of standardized protection, and most warriors likely fought wearing little more than animal hides, woven cloth, or plant-based materials. This lack of defense made survival an extreme challenge, especially for men who were capable of fighting. Simply reaching adulthood was an achievement in itself. In fact, the violent conditions of this era resulted in an astonishingly short lifespan. Most individuals only lived between 20 and 33 years. This makes it one of the periods where modern humans had the shortest life expectancy in history. And what's even more shocking, this low lifespan isn't just due to infant mortality. Even if a person survived childhood and reached 15, they still had very little chance of making it past 33. After considering all this nightmarish evidence, one simple yet baffling question remains. What on earth was going on? Why did it seem like everyone was constantly at war with everyone else? Unfortunately, there isn't a single definitive answer, but several theories have emerged. Ironically, one of the leading hypotheses suggests that humanity's own success may have been its downfall, a classic case of flying too close to the sun. The Neolithic Revolution, a double-edged sword. Not long before this wave of violence erupted, humanity underwent a monumental shift. The Neolithic Revolution, also known as the First Agricultural Revolution. This was the period in which many human cultures transitioned from being nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. The ability to cultivate crops and domesticate animals led to a surge in population growth, the rise of permanent settlements, the development of specialized trades and new technologies. At first glance, this sounds like a tremendous success. However, this transition fundamentally altered human conflict in ways that had never been seen before. With larger, more structured settlements, humans could now organize powerful, battle-ready groups, allowing for mass violence on an unprecedented scale. These same settlements also gave rise to new reasons for war, reasons that simply did not exist before. For the first time in history, settlements and farms represented guaranteed loot, food, and women, all in one place. This turned them into prime targets for raiding and conquest. Additionally, proximity itself may have been a source of tension. As settlements expanded, they may have been perceived as hostile encroachments by neighboring groups. This could have fueled the belief that all outsiders were a threat and that preemptive strikes were necessary for survival. Why were men the primary victims? One particularly intriguing theory seeks to explain why the Y chromosome, which is passed exclusively from father to son, was so devastated during this period. As societies reorganized, many groups transitioned to patrilineal kinship structures, meaning that ancestry, inheritance, and power were traced through the male line. This shift may have occurred because trust was a rare commodity, and it was simply easier to rely on family members rather than outsiders. As a result, women had relatively free movement between groups, as they could be taken as wives, captives, or diplomatic exchanges. Men, however, faced extreme restrictions. If you were an outsider, you were not welcome. This rigid exclusion of foreign men would have made the Y chromosome extremely vulnerable. Thus, when rival clans went to war, they didn't just kill random individuals. They systematically wiped out entire male bloodlines, leading to a one-sided genetic bottleneck that shaped human ancestry for generations. Like many scientific theories, this one has its detractors. Those who argue that the genetic bottleneck might not have been solely the result of widespread violence, while the sheer number of skeletal remains suggests that brutality was undoubtedly common during this period. Some researchers propose a more peaceful explanation for the Y chromosome decline. One alternative theory suggests that patrilineal clans frequently split apart through a non-violent process known as lineage. According to this idea, as these new clans formed, they were composed primarily of closely related males. This weakened the diversity of Y chromosome lineages, making them more vulnerable to disappearing over time, particularly in response to environmental hardships. This natural decline in Y chromosome diversity was further amplified by reproductive fitness. Some male lineages were exceptionally successful, allowing their populations to thrive, expand, and divide, further reinforcing their dominance. Other lineages failed to keep up, gradually dwindled, and ultimately vanished altogether. Violence or natural selection, or both. Of course, it's also possible that both theories are correct, that the violent and peaceful explanations were hand in hand, both contributing to the drastic reduction in the effective male population, regardless of the cause. There's no denying that something significant happened. Even today, the genetic impact of this bottleneck remains, as certain populations still have not regained the diversity levels that existed before the event. Had this bottleneck never occurred, the genetic landscape of humanity would likely look very different today. That being said, our species has mostly recovered over time, and on the bright side, we no longer kill every outsider on sight. So, at least there's that improvement. How did this era of violence end? The short answer: it didn't. At least, not completely. Over time, more people have died in wars than ever before, particularly with the advent of new military technologies. However, The key difference is that human populations grew at a faster rate than they died, meaning that violence became proportionally less destructive. As societies became more complex, the emergence of trade, diplomacy, and structured governance provided alternatives to constant warfare. However, if we zoom in on the last 600 years, we see that this cooling off is a relatively recent phenomenon. In fact, it was only in the last century that humanity began a meaningful decline in war frequency, with the number of new conflicts starting each year entering a downward trend. World War II. While violence and war have not been entirely eliminated, history suggests that we are, at least for now, on a different path than our Neolithic ancestors. While it may be hard to imagine, the world we live in today is remarkably peaceful compared to the one our ancestors endured. This shift is reflected in our dramatically increased lifespans, which are now over 3 times longer than those of the Neolithic era. Of course, modern life is not without its challenges, but personally, I am relieved that I no longer have to worry about skull cults or marauding warriors shattering my shins, at least for the most part. Click on the video on your screen to keep enjoying our content. See you in the next video.